There was only a fingertip of water left in the clay pot. Marina cupped it on the back of her hand, felt the cold bead for an instant, and let it fall back into the cracked earth. Around her, the yard held the day like a held breath. The hens clustered beneath the shade of a broken carnauba. The well stood dry and patient, and the sky, relentless as an accusation, refused to yield even a cloud. Her child's cough came from the next room, thin, quick, the sound of a small chest scraping against the dry season, and Marina listened as if she could divide the noise in two and give half of it away. She had learned over the months that followed her father's fever how to measure hunger as one measures rope, 1 knot per day, tightening until even the knots frayed. Her mother moved with the slow economy of someone who had long ago given up on abundance. Donna Ephigenia's hands told the story of a lifetime of saving, their edges raw, the nails always cut short to stretch soap and bread as far as possible. The younger ones, the twins, Tete and Nenzinho Marina, kept busy with small, urgent games that pretended the house could hold laughter forever. But hunger was not a pretend thing. Hunger was a schedule, punctual and implacable. It sat on the table like a modest guest that never left. When Padre Anselmo came, he came with a clean collar and a face that had learned to weigh words before offering them. He sat at the kitchen table where the sun fell across the tablecloth in a strip of dusty gold and listened. Marina watched him watch her mother's hands. He did not bring promises of rain. He did not speak with the easy slogans of men who made providence into bargaining. Instead, he told them what he had already tried to tell himself. There were people willing to help, but help in that valley did not come without conditions. He folded his hands on the table and offered the truth in the manner of someone telling a story that could save lives if heard plainly. "Mr. Teodoro has sent word," he said at last. "He is a widower. He has land enough for a family. He will take one of your daughters into his house, give shelter, food, work. He will not promise love. He will promise bread. The farm needs a housekeeper. He writes he is a strict man. He writes he has a boy who doesn't speak like other boys since the fever. He asks only for honesty." Marina had been counting stolen spoons by number lately, inventorying what could be traded for flour or fuel. She had not counted her own dignity. The word dignity is a soft cloth over a rough hand. It is dignity that makes a woman button the same dress with deliberate care, even when no one will see the buttons. That keeps a body straight while the world asks it to bow. Standing there, with the faint smell of coffee and the memory of her father's heavy hand resting on her hair, Marina understood what the priest could not rearrange with words. An offer like Teodoro's was a crossroads. It was a moral geometry she had to navigate. She could preserve the last of her family's honor and watch them wither, or she could step into a life that would ask everything and demand she leave a piece of herself behind. She imagined herself in a neat house with a tiled floor, children with clean shirts, bread rising under a cloth instead of a fistful of farina kept for a single meal. She thought of her mother's rib cage under the thin dress and of Marina's small mouth that tried to whistle a tune it had heard once. She stood and walked out into the yard to decide on earth that had no right to keep her forever, and the clay pot shone like a single truth. Survival had a price, and sometimes the price was one you paid with your name. The ceremony, when it took place, was small and did not pretend otherwise. A priest in his plain cassock, a church with its plaster peeling in places where the heat did not forgive, a handful of neighbors who had come because neighbors in that valley measured charity in acts, not in words. Padre Anselmo read the rites with careful gentleness, as if in a whisper to the emptiness of the season, and Marina walked forward in a dress that would have been ordinary, but for the way she arranged it to look like something worth keeping. Teodoro stood at the front like a statue carved from drought, hands clean, hair combed, his face a geography of grief. He did not look as if he had been softened by prayer. He looked like a man who had learned to live with hard edges. Marina said the words she had to say. She did not promise a love that was not there. She promised household honesty, presence. The vows were surgical in their honesty. There was a dignity in the economy of language. There was no theatrics. After the blessing, the few who could remain offered brief congratulations, hands awkwardly warm, eyes that tried to be both compassionate and pragmatic. Donna Ephigenia wept in a way that was half release, half grief for the child she was sending across a threshold. Marina folded her hands until the knuckles knotted white and met her mother's gaze as if to say, "Keep the house, keep the name, keep the story. I am going." If this story of sacrifice and slow, unexpected hope is touching you, consider subscribing for more stories like this, tales of faith, choice, and the quiet courage that keeps families alive. They left at dawn. The road was a ribbon of dust, and the early light made the mesquite trees into black silhouettes against a pale sky that pretended it might rain someday. Marina climbed onto the back of a wagon and held herself as if she were bracing for a long voyage. Behind her, the house grew smaller, the yard's cracked earth less familiar, until the wind took the sound of her brothers' voices and kept it for itself. Fazenda Santa Luzia rose like an island in a dry sea. The fields were not lush, not yet. No miracle, the land still bore the scars of the long summer, but there was a scale here she had not seen in years. A stone wall, a well that held more than a finger of water, a courtyard with pots that jingled faintly when the servants walked by. The house itself was generous in a way that suggested decades of order. Wide eaves to keep the noon off the windows, a veranda with creaking boards, a carved wooden door that held the story of careful hands and good repair. Someone had loved this place with habits that were daily rituals. Inside, the portrait of Isaura claimed the space with an authority Marina had not expected. It was a small painting, the colors faded by time. Isaura's hair arranged in a style Marina had only seen in photographs, smile slight but steady. The portrait was framed and placed on a small altar, lit by a single candle that seemed to burn with its own stubbornness. Near it, a room sat closed, the door locked with reverence. The house kept its dead woman like a presence one could neither deny nor forget. Marietta met Marina at the threshold, with the guarded eyes of someone who has kept a house through storms and loss, and refuses to let new hands change the way things were done without proving themselves. She was not unkind, she was loyal to the memory of Isaura, to the household that had been carved around a woman's absence. Her loyalty made her strict. She measured Marina as a housekeeper would measure flour, precisely and with concern that what little there was be used wisely. Teodoro himself spoke rarely. When he did, his voice was measured, as if speaking could unsettle the household's fragile balance. He had the look of a man whose love had been converted into a slow private mourning. Where others might have burned his grief rawly, he had set it into a pattern, careful, guarded, almost ritualized in its restraint. He kept the rules of the house as if they were sacred, and in that careful keeping he had built a fortress that kept everything out, including warmth. The first night he introduced Marina to Pedrinho, it was under halogen lantern light that smelled faintly of oil. Pedrinho was small and wore his hair as if it had been cut by hands that did not know how to make a boy feel safe. He did not run to Marina the way other children did to strangers, who meant cookies and stories. He watched her with eyes that were older than his years, eyes that had learned certain silences. But when Marina spoke to him, she used a voice shaped by hunger and water. Her voice had a particular gravitas that children, even wounded ones, notice. She spoke of small, steady things, where the plates went, how the garden kept secrets if you listened, how a bath could make the whole body remember it belonged to the living. She learned quickly, because necessity makes lessons sharp. She learned how Teodoro liked the coffee, strong and without sugar, and how Marietta set the plates with surgical exactness. She learned the rhythms of the farm, the way the rooster woke like a clock, the timing of the cattle's calls, the manner in which rain or no rain altered the garden's mood. But she also learned another quieter curriculum, how the portrait of Isaura filled the corners of conversation, how the closed room kept a silence that was almost a presence, the way names were sometimes used like offerings to the past. Marina kept her dignity like a garment she refused to dirty. She found small ways to assert herself that did not ask too much of the household, but kept a personal line from breaking. She mended a shirt with a seam that no one noticed, but that made the wearer hold himself straighter. She saved the last slice of bread for a child whose stomach spoke in soft protests late at night. She folded the pillowcases with a precision that never seemed to earn a compliment, but that left them neatly arranged come morning. The hard work of modest daily acts began to lay a foundation that no roof of grief could immediately dislodge. And yet the house, like many houses that have loved fiercely and lost, kept its grief like furniture. Visible, heavy, arranged in a way that required new bodies to learn how to move around it. Teodoro's distance did not soften because Marina cleaned his boots one night and replaced the burned coffee with a fresh pot. His small kindnesses were like stones laid carefully across the river, steady, singular, but not bridges. Pedrinho, for all his silence, started to allow a small reckoning with his fear. He watched Marina as if she might be the first adult to let him test whether the world was dangerous or merely sad. One afternoon, she found him on the veranda, knees drawn up, a wooden horse half-carved beside him. His fingers had learned the slow choreography of carving. Each shaving's curl was a small private work of attention. "Why do you make horses?" Marina asked, sitting beside him without being asked. Pedrinho looked at the horse and then at her. "Because the horses go where I cannot," he said. The sentence was small and resigned, and had the precision of someone who had learned not to expand beyond the narrowness the world allowed. Marina smiled and took the knife carefully from his fingers. "Then make it run," she told him. "Give it a tail that whips the dust. Give it a mouth so it can sing." He let her work, and the horse came alive under both of their hands. It was a small miracle, and the farm took note in subtle ways. Marietta watched them from the doorway, arms crossed, face unreadable. Teodoro, who happened to pass by the veranda at the wrong moment, stopped and looked at the two of them in a manner that made Marina's breath tighten. He neither thanked nor rebuked. He merely stood, like a man who had been made to think for a moment he had seen an intruder in his life and had to reconsider. The seasons on the farm did not change overnight. The sky remained stubborn, and the well kept to its small generosity. But there were shifts that went unnoticed until someone later took inventory. Pedrinho laughed one evening, an honest, small sound, and it struck everyone in the room like a bell. The sound was so foreign to the household's established cadence that even Marietta's mouth softened in the slightest. Teodoro cleared his throat and looked away, as if he had not known how to be present for the noise of a child rediscovering life. There were other quiet transactions that began to change the geometry of the house. Marina discovered, in a nailed-shut chest in the storeroom, letters tied with a faded ribbon. Isaura's letters to someone not named in grander accounts, but whose handwriting spoke of shared mornings and hands taken in secret. She read them with a tenderness that surprised her. They were ordinary, full of small jokes and the language of people who had learned to make a life together against the inconveniences of the world. Marina did not parade them around. She placed the letters back as she had found them and understood in a new way the size of the man she had married. He had loved in a way that made his absence of new love almost a shrine. To disturb that shrine seemed to Marina both sacrilege and a necessary sacrament. It was Donna Zephyr who first suggested that there was more than drought at work on the land. She came to the farm with the casual certainty of someone who had conversations with seasons and solace in her pocket. The Benzadera had a face like old leather, soft but reliable, and hands that smelled faintly of rosemary and crushed bay leaf. People in the valley parted for her, and made way as if she were a small force of nature. "You're careful," Marina said when they met in the courtyard, carrying a basket of fruit she had managed to salvage from an old tree. "You keep patience as if it were a tool." Donna Zephyr smiled like someone who had been given the coincidence of a good day. "Patience," she said, "is money that never dies, but some debts you cannot wait out. They must be paid with a different coin." Marina looked at her, curious and weary. "What do you mean?" "The house keeps a promise," Donna Zephyr said, and in those simple words she put a weight into the air. She did not clap the story into a neat ending. She let the words sit and be felt. Promises are bones under the floor of many houses. When they are broken, the house remembers with heat, fever, a field that will not yield, a child who won't speak. It is not always like that, but sometimes people forget that their words have weight. Marina felt the line of a new worry move across the back of her neck. She had already noticed how the portrait of Isaura seemed to direct the household's loyalties. She had already watched Teodoro's hands turn small and secret at the sight of the image of Santa Lucia that hung in the chapel near the property. But to be told plainly that words could shape a season was a new thing. "Did Teodoro break something?" she asked, because her brain had learned to make the world into practical things you could fix. Donna Zephyr's eyes were gentle but steady. "Long ago, before your time," she said, "there was a promise made in a chapel, something like a vow. When it was not kept, the valley suffered. People talk, the priest knows. But sometimes the house needs someone willing to be the one to start the counting of days again. Sometimes a child's asking will wake what the adults have tried to dampen." Marina listened like someone plotting the map of a long journey. The idea that words, unkept, forgotten, could have the slow work that drought had on fields, both frightened and intrigued her. It implied agency, it implied repair. It implied there might be a thing she could do that was not a sale of herself, but a reclaiming of a communal covenant. Donna Zephyr patted the basket at Marina's knees. "There are small actions," she said. "A novena, a candle, the bringing together of voices that have not sung for a while. People do not always see what kindness does, but words, when returned to their altar, sometimes make the sky remember how to soften." Marina considered the words and looked toward the chapel where, in the distance, the cross stood like a finger pointing to the empty sky. The house had its rituals: careful coffee, the placing of pillows, the locked room that smelled of old perfume. But perhaps, she thought, there is also room for new rituals. Perhaps a small determined act could be the start of a long repair. The thought settled in her the way seeds settle into dry soil, an uncertain hope. Because seeds do not promise blooms, only the possibility of growth if something else conspired. She had come to Teodoro's house for bread, to save a family from the edge. The bargain she had made had been honest. She would work, she would keep the house, she would not ask for what was not offered. But she had not come with the intention to become invisible, and she had not come to let a child be kept mute by grief. If there was any way to mend the small fractures that marked the place, she would try. That evening, as the sun sank like a coin into the horizon, Marina walked the path toward the small chapel at the back of the property. The chapel was built of thick stones, its whitewashed walls marked by a thin ribbon of shadow cast by the bell tower. Inside, the image of Santa Lucia glowed softly under a cloth that had seen many hands. The scent of wax and old flowers hung in the air, a quiet testament to the faith of people who measured the world in small, ritualized acts. She stood before the image and let the silence do the work of prayer without quite praying words she did not yet own. Her fingers brushed the hem of her dress, as if arranging it like a promise. When she walked back to the house, the wind had taken up a small sighing sound, and somewhere beyond the trees a dog barked once, as if to mark the passage of someone who had decided, under the weight of hunger and love for her family, to do what it takes. Marina walked back across the courtyard with the stain of chapel light still on her hands, as if the image of Santa Lucia had left its quiet brightness on her skin. The air held the same dry insistence it always had, but something inside her had shifted. The decision she'd made beneath painted eyes felt less like a private vow and more like a small lever placed into the mechanics of a very large, slow machine. She could marry for bread and leave it at that. Or she could, without risking her honor, try to stitch a few frayed threads back into a household that had been cut by grief. Donna Zephyr was waiting near the kitchen door when Marina returned, as if she had known the young woman would not remain idle. The Benzadera's hands smelled of crushed bay leaf. Her face, mapped with years, brightened the way it did when someone came with an idea instead of a complaint. "You decided?" Donna Zephyr asked. She did not speak at the level of sermons. Her words landed like tools. Marina told her of the chapel and of the image, of how prayer had felt like a hand on the back of her neck, not commanding, but urging. "We need voices," she said, "not because voices themselves make rain, but because people stop alone when they are quiet long enough." Donna Zephyr nodded, and without ceremony began to give practical counsel. "You bring people together, you light candles, you keep the nights. Leave the rest to what God and the weather will do." Her tone was a mixture of folk certainty and caution. She insisted on action, but never promised outcomes as if they were coins. The next morning, Marina found Padre Anselmo in the sacristy, cataloguing used candles like someone counting the small economies of faith. He listened without surprise when she asked to begin a novena to Santa Lucia. The priest had been acquainted with despair in many forms. He knew the valley's weather and its people, by the small details of their prayers. He did not tell her that prayer was the sole cause of good things. He offered instead something steadier, a church, a schedule, a place for people to be seen. "A novena will gather them," he said finally, folding his hands the way people fold maps. "It will give them a reason to meet and to bring what they can. Bread, a chicken, a blanket. It will show the village we are not content to let grief become a habit. I will say Mass for the 9th night. If you will have the courage to ask, I will stand with you." Marina left the sacristy with the simple scaffolding of a plan. She went house to house that afternoon, carrying nothing more elaborate than the courage she had worn like a second dress. To the widow near the well, she proposed a covered dish for the first night. To the farmer across the path, she asked if his son might bring the lamp he kept for funerals. To Donna Marietta, who had memorized the angles of the farmhouse, she did not ask at first. Marietta's loyalty to a lived memory made her wary of change, but Marina knew she needed Marietta's quiet power to persuade Teodoro even to attend. The novena began, and the first night was small. The chapel smelled of wax and boiled coffee. The congregation was a handful of people who had every reason to be cynical and yet came with candlelight. Marina noticed how neighbors carried their offerings, some a sack of flour, others a wrapped chicken, a few with nothing they could give but their presence. They sat in a pew that had recently been sanded smooth by 1,000 knees, and in the hush, their voices were awkward at first, like people unsure whether they had the right to the sins of hope. Marietta's attendance was tentative. She sat with hands folded so tightly the knuckles whitened, as if clasping grief against the temptation of new affection. Teodoro came only once in the first 3 nights, standing at the rear with his hat rimmed in the dim light, immovable as a sentinel. He did not sing, he only listened, and even that minimal motion seemed to require a small courage he did not give easily. Each night grew a little. Word spread not by proclamation, but by the way one woman told another over a fence. Mothers brought their children. Men who had avoided church for years came because their wives said it was time to try something. The novena did not promise answers. It offered rhythm. People who had been isolated by shame or fear found themselves sitting shoulder to shoulder with those they had judged. They exchanged small confidences about which field to plant and which seed would survive the heat. The novena stitched a community into a pattern that made memory and hope work at once. Marina moved through the nights with a steady diligence. She arranged candles, swept the chapel steps, and stayed late to keep the oil lamps from guttering. People confided in her. Some told stories of rain once known long ago. Others shared the secret of how their father had spoken to the land. She learned the local music as if it were a language, and when the villagers sang, their voices, rough in places, beautiful in others, made the chapel vibrate like skin over a drum. Pedrinho's participation grew in small increments. He came at first with his head down, hands in his pockets, reluctant to be near anything that might command sentiment he couldn't bear. One evening Marina coaxed him into singing a line from an old hymn he remembered from childhood. The sound came out thin but true, and when he looked up, his face had the astonishment of someone who had found his own throat again. The child's slight triumph sent a ripple through the chapel. An older man wiped his eye discreetly, and Marietta, who had been stoic for so long, let the lines of her mouth slacken for a single moment. Teodoro watched these changes from the edge of himself, like a man reading someone else's letter. The novena obliged him to be present, and presence, he discovered, was a dangerous therapy. He began to notice the small details. A child's shoe left askew, a plate with a chip carefully placed face down, the way the light caught Marina's hair when she moved to light a candle. Each observation was like an old wound touched with a warm finger, painful, and then oddly bearable. Behind Teodoro's stoicism was a memory he had not allowed himself to interrogate fully. He had loved Isaura in a certain unquestioning style, through rituals, through the habit of leaving a chair for her in the kitchen, through the carved bench at the chapel steps that bore the imprint of her body. When she died, Teodoro had turned his mourning outward by preserving the house as a shrine, by setting the portrait where no one could rearrange it. He had promised at some point to keep an image lit, to return a devotion to the chapel, to honor something that had been sacred. Grief, however, had hardened into stubbornness. Where his promise once was a curve of tenderness, It had calcified into a refusal to participate in life that might dilute the purity of his memory. It was Pedrinho who broke the silence around that promise. One night during the novena, the boy wandered from his seat to the front of the chapel, and before any adult could stop him, he unfolded himself at the altar with the solemnity of a child at prayer. He did not kneel perfectly. His knees scraped the worn wood. He looked at the portrait of Isaura with a gaze that had the desperate innocence of someone asking a question the adults had named too complicated to answer. "Mama," he said in the simple, raw language children sometimes use to name what the world has stolen. The word was a small animal, skittering free from his throat. For a moment the chapel held its breath. Some muttered prayers were swallowed by raw silence. Marina felt her own chest tighten. Teodoro's hands clenched into fists under his jacket, as if to contain the sound of a heart that had been slamming against the bones of his ribs for years. Pedrinho's plea was not rhetorical. That night, after the final hymn and after people had begun to file out into the cool night, he walked with Teodoro to the closed room. He knocked with the blunt insistence of someone who believed knocking still had power. "Open," the boy said in a voice that was both command and entreaty. "Open, Papa. I want to see her. I want to tell her it's raining in the sky of my head." What pierced Teodoro most was not the child's words alone, but the way the child had placed himself between a living man and a memory, as if to say, "The past is not finished yet. It has power here." The old promise, once kept like a coin in a coffin, became a living thing in Pedrinho's mouth. Teodoro's knees gave a little. For the first time in years, he felt the jagged edge of his own oath. Alone that night, with only the moon to attend him, Teodoro went to the room he had kept closed. He removed the key with hands that shook as if with age. Inside the room, the air had the scent of lavender and dust. On the dresser lay the letters Marina had once found, tied with a faded ribbon, reminders of ordinary happiness. On a small table, a candle stub had long since perished. In the corner, a box contained an image of Santa Lucia, wrapped in a cloth worn thin by time. Teodoro unfolded the cloth and sat as memory, and the decades of his stubborn grief pressed on him. He remembered a night, a vow made under a chapel light, while laughter and the clink of cups were still present at the edges of his life. He had promised to keep an image lit as long as he lived. He had pledged to return yearly to the altar to give thanks. He had not kept that promise. After Isaura died, keeping that promise felt like laughing in the face of loss, as if the act of devotion could be a betrayal of what he felt. So he stopped. He turned his back on the living world, and in so doing, allowed the household to harden into a museum. That night, he took the image of Santa Lucia and walked to the chapel. He carried it with a kind of careful terror, afraid of mockery, afraid of feeling diminished, afraid of the small tremor of contrition that made him human. He placed the image on the altar, and without fuss set a candle near it. The flame caught and bled light over the painted face of the saint. Teodoro remained on his feet, hands trembling not from the cold, but from the affront of humility. When Marina arrived for the early morning chores, she found the chapel door unlocked and the candle burning. She knelt before the altar and, without forcing the shape of the prayer, let the words come. A simple, "Our Father," a few whispered fragments meant for a God who both listens and meets people in their cautious steps. Padre Anselmo came upon her then, saw the candle, and understood that something had shifted. He did not speak at once. In the small ministry of the sacristy, they both felt the movement like a weather pattern changing. News spread slowly, no gossip that would cheapen what had occurred, but a measured understanding that Teodoro had not only come back to a ritual, he had repaired a piece of himself. The men at the market remarked not on miraculous rain, but on the image's presence, and the quiet act of a man who had broken his promise and now kept it. For some it was a relief to see the stubborn landowner unshackle himself from a shrine. For the most faithful, it was witness that a broken covenant had been mended. The 9th night of the novena arrived, and the chapel was fuller than it had ever been. There were more candles than the little building seemed designed to hold. People stood in the courtyard, some on the threshold, others in the churchyard, where the moonlight made lace of their shadows. Padre Anselmo read from the Gospel, and then, in his homily, spoke of promises made and promises kept. of how a community's healing often begins at the level of small, determined acts rather than grandiose gestures. It was Teodoro who rose then, moved by something deeper than pride and deeper than habit. He stepped forward, unbuttoned his jacket with a stiffness that betrayed his nerves, and in a voice roughened by disuse and emotion, he spoke to the assembly. He did not frame himself as a paragon or expect absolution as a token. He accounted humbly for the years he had closed himself off, for the way he had allowed grief to calcify into an obstacle between people who still needed each other. He apologized, not a long confession of every sin, but a man's honest admission of failure. He thanked Marina for coming to his house, for keeping a home he could not tend to, for being the presence that taught his son to laugh again. When he named her by name, the air itself seemed to find a new arrangement. He went further than most would have expected. He asked forgiveness from those he had shut out, the villagers who had hoped he would return to their shared rhythms, the very land he had neglected through intentional absence. He promised to keep the image, to return each year to the altar, to participate in the household not as a man who claims ownership, but as one who shares responsibility. The confession was not theatrical. It was a man speaking his truth in a place where truth could be held by others. When the assembly rose to pray, there was no fanfare. People stepped forward to lay hands briefly on the image, to kiss its frame, to say a prayer. Pedrinho stood in the front, his face wet with tears he no longer had to hide. He stepped toward his father with a movement that was both tentative and inexorable, and Teodoro reached for him. The embrace was not perfect. It was awkward and long the way stitches sometimes are, but it was richly, undeniably human. They walked home from the chapel, beneath a sky the color of an unripe olive. The road smelled of dust and something else, the petrichor of a world that had not yet known the blessing of a storm, but seemed to hold the possibility. It began as a scatter, then steadied into a cadence. First a few drops on Teodoro's hat, then a steadiness that surprised the dogs, then a sound that made the children of the village stand and laugh in the street. Rain fell in a way that made the courtyard a place of small miracles, mud forming like fresh pages, the roof tiles exhaling as they received their baptism. People crossed themselves, not because rain was a reward, but because rain rearranged the day into a different grammar. Men who had spent months fixing fences because they could not trust the soil to hold a seed now moved with a different hope. Women drew water with laughter in their voices. Seeds that had been sown in hope and fear experienced the simple physics of water and sun. Some would rise, some would not. No one pretended the season had been magically reversed, but the rain allowed work to mean more than it had. It let plans go forward that had been on hold. In the months that followed, the farm woke in modest stages. Shoots rose from humble beds where Marina had planted beans and corn to test the soil's willingness. The well, once a grey pool, became a source to draw from with less ceremony and more management. Teodoro kept his word in ways that mattered. He participated in the stewarding of the fields. He joined conversations at the table where decisions were made, and he learned to listen more than he used to declare. His affection for Marina did not arrive full-blown like a sudden epiphany. It grew through tasks done together, through the way she moved, and the way the child's laughter bent toward him like a small, persistent bell. Marietta, slow as a tree in her reluctance, softened through a series of small reckonings. She could no longer resist the evidence that the household's preservation did not require shrine-like stillness. She saw how Pedrinho painted wooden horses and how the laughter he borrowed from the rest of the house stained the corners with color. Her gruff complaints became, over time, a vocabulary that included compliments. She would scold Marina in the morning, and then, halfway through a sentence, reach out to fold a towel for her as if the action itself erased bitterness. Marina never forgot the reason she had come to the farm. She continued to send support to her mother and siblings. Donna Efigenia and the children came to live in new rooms on the land that Teodoro, with a man's steady pride, offered in time. There was dignity in movement. The family did not appear as vanquished refugees, but as people who had made a hard choice and slowly reaped the consequence of courage. The twins found work learning to tend small plots. Marina took up a sewing trade that made neighbors' shirts last longer. They preserved the rhythm of their old lives with the new steadiness of a household that had been repaired. not by charity alone, but by the courage of a woman who refused to let need become something that meant humiliation. The child Pedrinho flourished with a small miracle the world could see without scientific instruments. He learned to speak the language of boys who believed they could chase a goat and return in time for supper. He stopped flinching at the sound of thunder. He began to speak about school one day, and then to hope for a life less marked by the peculiarities of a grieving father. The bond between him and Marina was not purely maternal, it was reciprocity. She had given him care, and he gave back a reason for his father to re-enter life. There were seasons that tested them. Drought whispered threats in later summers. Pests circled quiet fields one year. A fever hit a neighbor's home, and the house of Santa Lucia felt the weight of mortal uncertainty once more. They learned to respond as a household and as a village. They prayed. They worked. They tended. They did not promise that prayer served as a fail-safe. They offered it as part of the work of living with one another. When sickness struck a child in a nearby farm, the community rallied, and Padre Anselmo organized nights of vigil and supplication. The efficacy of faith was not spoken of as a program, it was lived as presence and mutual aid. In time, Teodoro's gestures toward Marina were no longer acts of repayment but of recognition. He began to bring her small things that were once beneath him to notice. A jar of preserves he had watched her make and kept in a cool place for a month before giving, an offer to share the morning coffee, a hand that lingered in the doorway when she was about to go out. The love between them formed not as an explosion, but as an accretion. Years of shared labor and grief and uncovered tenderness built a love that was patient and honest. They made a life together that honored Isaura's memory without making it an idol that kept them both chained. Years lengthened their story into a domestic epic. The fields produced, enough for seed and surplus. Marina's family became a visible presence in the rhythm of the land, a mother who taught neighbor girls how to knead bread that rose with the sun, twins who hauled water with lighter steps. Children were born under the eaves of Santa Lucia, little ones whose names stitched together the family's history and hopes. The house no longer had the look of a museum, but of a home that had weathered storms and chosen to open its doors. At the center of this remaking was a ritual they kept not out of superstition, but out of gratitude. Each year on the day of Santa Lucia, they walked to the chapel and lit a candle. Sometimes it rained that day, sometimes the sun pressed itself down like an insistence. They did not expect special favors. They commemorated a turning, a man who had learned to be present, a woman who had chosen dignity when choice was a hard bargain, a child who had been given permission to laugh. They gave thanks for the ordinary continuities that had been reclaimed from the brink of erosion. Decades later, when hair silvered and faces carried the soft maps of life, Marina and Teodoro sat beneath a carnauba tree that had been young when she first arrived. The field beyond them hummed with the industry of children and grandchildren. A wooden horse, now polished by many small hands, leaned near a low wall. The image of Santa Lucia hung in the chapel, its frame touched by hands that had learned to be careful with memory. They spoke little of the bargains made at the start. It was enough that the story existed in the lines of their skin and in the laughter of the children. Teodoro's voice had softened with age. He would reach for Marina's hand across the table and call her by a small private name she had once rejected for its sentiment. She would smile, and when he looked in her face, she would see years of things returned and improved. The village remembered their arc the way villages remember their own weather, in part as fact, in part as legend, and in equal measures as instruction and consolation. Mothers told the children the story, not as a manual, but as a moral fable. That sacrifice can preserve a family. Yes, but that sacrifice need not be surrender to erasure. That keeping one's dignity can coexist with choosing to live together. That promises kept matter both to roofs and to the inner lives of people. They spoke of how the novena had become a turning, not because the ritual was a transaction, but because it gathered people into a common will to change. They told of a man who had been made human again by the small insistence of a child and a woman who had traded no less than her ease for the bread that fed a family. There were moments of quiet stillness, an old couple walking slowly through fields they had once feared, when passers-by would nod and say, "They married for bread." Marina would smile and look at Teodoro, and then she would continue. And they found something worth everything. The phrase became less a punchline and more a lens through which people saw the possibility of transformation. Neither of them pretended the path had been tidy. There were regrets, moments of harsh words, the occasional ache that medicine could not soothe. But where regret sat, tenderness had room to grow. Where grief had hardened, laughter had found small breaches. Their love was built, as the narrator had seen from the beginning, out of work, of mending, of listening, of the daily small things that make habit into affection. On a late afternoon, when the children who had once been small were grown and brought their own families to the farmhouse for bread and for company, Marina stood by the kitchen window and looked out at the fields. The sun slanted and painted the rows of corn a deep green, and the well-supplied water reflected the sky like a blue promise. A wooden horse toppled in the yard as a toddler chased a goat, and the sound of laughter washed over the yard. Teodoro, leaning in the doorway, watched them with eyes that held both the memory of the man he had been and the quiet contentment of the man he had chosen to become. She had married for bread, an honest accounting, the kind of transaction that had preserved life when life seemed liable to ravel. But what had grown in the fullness of those years was more than food or shelter. It was a household that could be called a home, a love that had been coaxed from duty and honor into tenderness and companionship, a legacy that would outlast both of them. The land, once stubborn and closed, gave back in ways that made the early hunger seem like a prologue and not the whole story. When people came to hear of the story later, young couples, old widows, travelers, they often asked the same question with different faces. How did she do it? How did a woman keep her dignity and find a life that fed more than her body? The answer was not a single sentence, but a constellation of small acts. She kept her head high when the choice was bitter. She refused to be erased. She tended the child who could not laugh, and in doing so taught the household to laugh again. She brought the village together, not with spectacle, but with persistence. And she invited a hardened man to remember his own promises until he could stand, finally, before his neighbors and admit he had been wrong. There are endings that try to tie everything neatly. This is not one of those. Yet the arc here is honest. A woman who marched into a household on terms of survival, keeping her name and her dignity, and who, by the steady force of presence and the patient work of covenant, unlocked a love that proved more sustaining than the bread she had first sought. In the shade of the Carnoba, with the farmhouse humming softly with family, and with the chapel bell ringing at noon, Marina and Teodoro sat side by side. She laid her head on his shoulder for a moment, and felt not the weight of debt, but the gladness of a life chosen and remade. If this story has touched you, consider sharing a moment when an act of sacrifice opened a door to unexpected beauty. Your words might be the candle another household needs.